Grande Julião.
Beleza. Quem está aqui no Zoom, tá? Vamos fazer o seguinte, eu vou explicar um pouco em português aqui, quem está no Zoom, tá certo? Para vocês conseguirem, bom dia a todos, né? Explicar no Zoom como que vocês podem obter a tradução. Do lado aqui da reação, você tem a opção aqui. Espera aí. Vamos fazer o seguinte. Voltando aqui, quem está aqui no Zoom, inicialmente, você tem aqui reações e você tem a opção do globinho. Aqui a tradução, tá, gente? Quem está no Zoom, nós temos o Christoph, um tradutor de inglês para português. Será unidirecional, ou seja, teremos só a tradução do inglês para português e não do português para o inglês, tá? Então, assim, se tiverem alguma pergunta aqui no Zoom, vocês podem deixar no bate-papo, que eu faço a tradução e os convidados respondem e vocês vão ter a resposta aqui. Na tradução aqui, vocês têm duas opções. Se vocês deixarem em inglês, vocês vão me ouvir agora inicialmente, eu vou estar falando em português nesse primeiro momento, e depois, quando eu trocar e começar a falar inglês, vocês só vão ouvir 80% do volume, o Christoph traduzindo em português, só vai me ouvir em inglês. Se vocês quiserem trocar aqui, é só você mudar para português nesse globinho, tá? Então, assim, todo mundo que está aqui, por favor, Marcelo, se você puder colocar no comentário essa instrução, né, de como a gente... Quem quiser ouvir em inglês, deixa no globinho em inglês. Quem quiser ouvir em português, deixa no globinho aqui em português. Importante ressaltar que, inicialmente, vocês vão estar ouvindo em português, no globo de inglês, porque eu vou estar falando inicialmente em português, tá? Então, é importante isso, tá? Eu sei que eu estou falando em português no canal inglês, eu sei disso. Nesse primeiro momento, eu vou falar em português justamente para explicar como funciona esse globinho em português, para vocês entenderem como funciona esse globo. O Marcelo também vai me ajudar aí no bate-papo e a gente vai deixar essa instrução, tá? Por favor, desative o som de todo mundo, tá? Vamos desativar. Vamos desativar o som de todo mundo. Ótimo. Eu só estou dando um tempo, tem muita gente ingressando aqui ao mesmo tempo. E para a gente começar, o Marcelo vai repetir, vai colocar isso também nas nossas recomendações. E nós vamos começar em 3 minutos, tá? Vamos só aguardar mais um pouco. Beleza, eu acho que já admiti a maioria das pessoas aqui. Eu acho que a gente pode começar. A gente já está online, já está sendo transmitido pelo YouTube, pelo Facebook também. Então, quem está assistindo pelo YouTube e Facebook, obrigado pela participação. Bom dia a todos, tá? A gente está com bastante audiência, né, já nesse início. Inicialmente, o que é importante a gente comentar, né? Esse é nosso terceiro episódio. O que a gente combinou? Inicialmente, a gente faz um giro de notícias para falar um pouco do que aconteceu na semana, tá? Então, assim, o que eu achei importante relatar nessa semana a todos foi o que a gente já relatou no segundo episódio, que era o descompasso entre o ministro e o presidente, principalmente nas ações, e isso culminou com a queda do ministro, né, devido à polêmica do uso de cloroquina. Então, assim, esse é um tema bastante importante da semana. O nosso próximo podcast será gravado na próxima quarta, às 8 horas, e nós trataremos desse tema, tratamento. Então, nós teremos o Marcos Lacerda, que fez um estudo em Manaus sobre cloroquina, e também teremos a doutora Rô, da UTI, do Hospital das Clínicas da USP, justamente tratando desse tema e esclarecendo todas essas dúvidas. Então, já fica um anúncio aqui que próxima quarta nós iremos discutir o tema que está em discussão em Brasília, está em discussão nos jornais, que é o tratamento, e nesse tema de tratamento vai ter a questão da cloroquina, tá? Marcelo, você tem algum destaque dessa semana, Marcelo?
Tenho. Bom dia a todos. Sou Marcelo Lopes, sou cientista, moro atualmente em Michigan, e Júlio me deu essa função de ser o porta-voz internacional do Covid Café aqui, o repórter internacional. Então, a gente sempre atualiza com algumas informações que a gente achou interessante durante a semana aqui nos Estados Unidos, em particular no estado aqui de Michigan. O pessoal da saúde pública está comemorando bastante a redução do número de casos diários, né? Essa semana, o número de casos diários diminuiu para a menor quantidade desde março. Isso porque o isolamento social aqui no estado foi bem forçado pelos órgãos do governo do estado, e isso resultou em emergências mais vazias, diminuição de necessidade de você criar mais leitos de UTI, hospital de campanha. E agora, no fim do mês, existe a expectativa do que vai acontecer com o afrouxamento do relaxamento, das medidas o relaxamento das medidas de distanciamento social. O ambulatório, por exemplo, que a gente está, teve uma redução de 90% do número de atendimentos, e o pessoal está bem apreensivo agora com essa guinada aí do número de atendimentos, do que vai resultar em termos de novos casos. E assim é a expectativa, né? Agora, no fim do mês, deve se iniciar aí um afrouxamento, deve voltar pelo menos uma parte da economia a funcionar, e vamos ver o que isso vai influenciar em termos da epidemia aqui no país. É isso.
Ótimo, André. Ótimo, Marcelo. Queria chamar o André. O André está aí, André Siqueira. Se quiser falar um pouco de alguma das notícias da semana. André, você está aí? Acho que ele ainda não entrou. Eu acho que a gente pode iniciar André? Eu acho que a gente pode iniciar, né? Acho que o André está chegando aí ainda para o giro de notícias, depois ele pode complementar, tá? Essa semana nós temos 2 convidados especiais para falar do nosso terceiro episódio do podcast, que é Projeções para o Futuro, Ajudam, atrapalham. Agora eu vou mudar. André, você quer dar o seu reporte, André? André, ele está presente. Se quiser, André, fica à vontade, tá? Agora nós vamos mudar o idioma e vocês poderão acompanhar a tradução em português, clicando no globinho e selecionando português. Quem é o tradutor é o Christoph. Esse é um apoio da Fiocruz. Esse podcast e essa gravação conta com o apoio da Sociedade Brasileira de Infectologia, Sociedade Brasileira de Medicina Tropical, com o CAD, com o USP, Oxford, a Universidade Federal do Mato Grosso do Sul, e diversos parceiros, diversos professores e pesquisadores que estão nos apoiando nessa iniciativa de levar o conhecimento científico de uma forma mais palatável para toda a comunidade, tá? Então, a partir de agora, se vocês quiserem, vocês podem mudar o íconezinho do globo no Zoom e selecionar português. O Christoph conseguiu essa tradução junto com a Fiocruz, então vocês podem utilizar à vontade, tá bom? Vocês podem utilizar à vontade. Então, eu vou passar agora a falar em inglês, tá? I'd like to introduce your 2 guests from COVID Café Podcast. Thomas Mellon is a research associate, and Samir Bhatt is a senior lecturer for the Imperial College of Public Health. Also, you have this Sid Flexman and Swipin Mirash from Imperial College, who assisted to answer some questions. Imperial College have been assisted several countries and cities with projections, and on last May 15, they published a specific report from Brazil. First of all, I would like to thank Nuno for making this connection, and I would like to make a more general first question for both of you. Samir and Thomas, how the models work? Do you expect that the inconsistency in the data will be impact the accuracy of the model estimatives? How the model account for this? The first question is to explain the idea to work with the model, to understand that data is not, they try to predict the future, but have some data necessary to do this prediction. Thomas and Sami, the floor is with you. You can answer these first questions.
Yeah, so I mean, I would just say not even considering predicting the future, but simply considering trying to estimate the current situation. This is extremely difficult, and there's quite a lot of uncertainty, and much of this uncertainty comes from the data. So I think it's important to emphasize that we are extremely limited by the data that we receive. And this is a problem not just in Brazil, this is a problem in many countries. The data in different countries is recorded in different ways. For example, some countries are only including hospital deaths in their statistics, at least for some time, and there are different lags in the data. So this is a really big issue, and it certainly affects the predictions that we can make with our models. So this is something that we're acutely aware of. Can you hear me? So the only thing that we can, I mean, as I was saying, we're reliant on the data that we receive that's presented by government. So it's absolutely critical that this is timely and it's accurate. And this will affect the models. We are trying to account for this, or at least estimate the uncertainty by doing sensitivity analysis. So for example, in our report, in report 21, we considered that in Brazil, just like in many countries, there might be some underreporting of deaths. So whenever we're making our conclusions as to, for example, whether or not herd immunity has been reached in Brazil, we consider, are the deaths that we're receiving realistic? And we consider different scenarios for this. So I suppose to summarize, we are dependent on the data, and we do try to account for this. I mean, as well as uncertainty from the data, there's also uncertainty from the model itself. The model, of course, is just a facsimile of reality. It doesn't capture every feature of the epidemic perfectly. We try to capture as many features as possible. For example, in Brazil, in our report, we tried to capture spatial heterogeneity by looking at how the epidemic was progressing in different states individually. And we find it's hugely heterogeneous in Brazil. So whereas some people might just consider the epidemic in Brazil as one, within our group, we think that's really not sufficient, because I mean, Brazil is such an enormous country. It's really continental in scale, over 200 million people. So breaking it down in terms of state is the least that we can do. But there's, but even breaking it down in terms of state, this is really just the first step, and it's there's still sources of uncertainty, of course, because within a state there's huge differences. You know, even within a city like Sao Paulo, there will be hotspots, and these are things that are difficult for us to account, and will of course contribute to uncertainty within the model. I don't know if Sam or anybody else wants to add anything to that.
Julio, just a comment that The translation is not working right now. I'm not sure if Christopher needs to unmute his mic, but it's a complaint that's getting from the chat. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, no problem. No problem. I think Chris tried to solve this problem for the translation. In the beginning, you check this work very well. Let's to check if the Christopher can translation. Só para explicar novamente, pessoal, tem um globinho aqui embaixo, vocês têm que selecionar português, tá? Se vocês ficarem no canal inglês, vocês só ouvirão em inglês. Vocês têm que selecionar português nesse globinho, tá? Alguém conseguiu ouvir o Christoph, por favor? Tá.
Problem solved, I guess.
I guess so. Cristo. Eu acho que sim, vocês podem. O inglês acompanha no inglês, o português acompanha no português. Depende de onde vocês querem acompanhar. O Christoph vai tentar fazer a tradução simultaneamente, tá? Let's to return to your discussion. And Thomas, it's only quick questions. Do you analyze several data from different countries, different cities? How the quality of the Brazilian data to try to estimate the reproductive numbers and to modeling the future?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are different aspects to this question on the quality of the Brazilian data. I mean, one thing that I would say is that we're trying to estimate the total number of cases and the attack rate, and that we don't do this by relying on the number of reported cases itself. We rely on the number of reported deaths. This is because we think that the number of reported cases is in general, not just in Brazil, but everywhere, is a gross underestimate of the true number of cases. So what we do is we assume that the number of deaths being reported is significantly more accurate, and then we calculate the number of cases from that, and we can compute the attack rate and the reproduction number. Now, this gets us around one problem. It gets us around the problem of having to use cases, which we know are awful everywhere. But now we have the problem of using death data. This should be, in general, more reliable. Hopefully, that everybody that's dying of a respiratory related illness is being tested for COVID, and hopefully that's being reported. But from one country to another, there is a lag between the death occurring and the test happening, and that death being reported, and that is something that is generally unknown, and that will be a source of error in our model, and that's something that's very difficult to deal with. So we have to emphasize that, you know, if possible, we need to get the data from the deaths as soon as possible.
Okay, I think you try to solve the translation here.
Yeah,
I think now it's work. Everybody can understand it in Portuguese. Perfect. Now you have the translation. Okay.
Excellent.
Now you have the translation, and the Brazilian can understand you.
Nice.
Great. Sorry for this problem in the beginning, Thomas. maybe you can discuss more.
Yeah,
can...
if you like, I have some slides I could run through.
Great. You can show your slide, Christoph. Maybe you can make a summary of the principal finds of reported 21.
Yeah.
And explain how confident is the model generated for Brazil.
Yeah, I will do that. If I'm going too slow or if it's getting too boring, just try to hurry me up and I'll try to skip through that bit. Okay. So I mean, I'll give you a quick summary of the model, how it works, and then the specific adaptations we've made to our model for Brazil, and then some specific results for Brazil. Okay, so let me see if I can share my screen with you. Let's see. Okay, so host disabled attendee screen sharing. So can you enable me to share my screen, please?
Yes.
Thanks. Perfect. Yeah, that's working now. Now, normally whenever I try to pick the right thing to share, I normally share the completely wrong document. So let's see if this works. Okay, can you see my screen okay there?
Perfect.
Okay, excellent. So this is report 21, estimating the number of cases and the reproduction number in Brazil. And this work was done with a range of people: Henrique, Swapnil, Charlie, Ricardo, Seth, and a whole bunch of other people from the COVID team. So just a little bit of background. I mean, there are a number of different ways to characterize the epidemic. We could try to, for example, do random testing in order to get around biases of age. And hopefully if we just random tested lots of people on lots of different days, we would be able to identify symptomatic and asymptomatic cases. However, the resources needed to do this are huge. So this is generally not being done. Other ways to estimate the extent of the epidemic would be to consider the cases that we're picking up from clinical presentations in hospitals. So we're swabbing people and doing PCR, and we're seeing how many cases that way. But of course, this vastly underestimates the number of true cases, if that's what you're interested in. Of course, the cases that we are seeing on clinical presentation are important because these are the worst cases, but we're still missing a lot of stuff. And if we really want to know how the epidemic is progressing, we need to get a wider picture. So I mean, there's a range of methods. I mean, a highly regarded method is phylogenetic analysis, whereby we can look at the evolutionary distance of different sampled genomes as a function of time, and from this infer the reproduction number. But of course, this requires access to genomes, and it requires sophisticated analytical techniques. So I mean, every method to try to characterize the epidemic has its positives and its minus points, and really should be considered together. But the technique that we use, that we think is quite good, is to estimate the number of cases from the reported number of deaths, because hopefully the reported number of deaths will be a better reflection of the true number of deaths than the reported number of cases is a reflection of the true number of cases. So how do we do this? Our approach to modeling is hopefully, I'm trying to summarize our philosophy in this slide, which I hope you can see. So our approach to modeling is hopefully principled, in the sense that we can derive it from first principles. So if we consider how a virus spreads in the simplest possible way, there's some infected individual, and after some random amount of time, they'll infect a random amount of secondary cases. And from considering this microscopic description, we can derive simple equations that we've used in our work. Now, the equations that we derive are what's known as the renewal equation for infections. And this equation, which is perhaps deceptively simple, this describes how the number of cases at some time, for example now, can be calculated from cases at previous times as a function of some generating process. So if we wanted to say this in a mathematically sophisticated way, we would say that the number of cases at some time now is a convolution of cases in past times and some generating process. So this just means we're counting up all of the previous cases and how infectious they were and how many different cases they caused. So that's what we're doing. And in order to do this, we use a Markov chain Monte Carlo technique to fit the parameters in our model. And this is nice because it gives us a distribution for any predictions that we make. So for example, if we say we think the reproduction number is 1.5, we can give credible intervals to say, well, credible intervals to characterize well, how credible that figure is. And we do this by effectively sampling thousands of different possible parameter combinations. So, I mean, I don't know how many people in the audience here are mathematicians, so I'm really not going to spend too much time on the mathematics of the model, but just to say that the number of cases C in some country is related to the number of cases at previous times some generating process. And here we've split the generating process up into a serial interval time G, which describes the temporal distribution of the infectiousness, really. So if I'm infected, tomorrow today I'm perhaps not very infectious to other people. Tomorrow I will be more infectious, and then I'll keep getting more infectious for perhaps 5 or 6 days when I'll be at my peak infectiousness, and then my infectiousness will come down. So that's what's described by this parameter G. And of course we have the reproduction number, which is part of this. And this is in a sense like the magnitude of the infectiousness. This is the effective, this is the number of, well, I suppose the simplest way to describe it would be if there's one infected individual, how many people do they infect on average? So typically for something like coronavirus, this is around 3. As people change their behavior, this is generally dropped to around 1, slightly above in some countries, slightly below in others. So this is the basic equation. That was the basic equation that describes cases, the number of cases of infection. And in our model, the reproduction time, we consider this to be a function of time, and we consider it to be indexed by country as well. So the reproduction number at some time in some country is equal to the reproduction number, the basic reproduction number. So that's the reproduction number right at the start of the epidemic. And it's a function of some parameters that we can, so we try to really, in this model, we try to soak up as much data from as many sources as possible. So we say that the reproduction number, how many people an infected individual is likely to infect, we say that this is a function of some covariates, and these covariates in our model describe how people behave in terms of their mobility. So in this model, we've included data from Google mobility reports, and these describe whether people are staying at home or whether or not they are social distancing, well, whether they're staying at home or whether or not they're spending much time traveling or in parks and things like that. So we try to include all of this information to try to give some structure to how the reproduction number changes with time. Okay, I mean, I really don't want to spend too much time going through the maths because I know it's perhaps of marginal interest, but just to say that we also account for a kind of discount factor S, which removes individuals from our reservoir of susceptible that have already been infected. And that the serial interval time that we use to describe the infectiousness process, this is a gamma distribution with mean 6.5 and some shape parameter. Okay, I mean, this is all quite technical stuff, so let's skip ahead. Well, this is another quite important equation as well. So it's critical. So I will actually describe this. So I mean, there's two critical equations here. One is the renewal equation that links cases now to cases in the past. And the second is the equation that links deaths to cases. So we say that deaths at some time in some country are related to cases that have occurred by the infection fatality ratio. And this is something that we really have to consider quite carefully for Brazil, and I will come back to in a minute. So deaths are related to cases by a convolution of the number of cases in past time with some process that relates the chance of dying given that you've been infected, some temporal distribution. So this is given by your chance of, well, we consider this death distribution essentially to be the chance of becoming how long it takes to become symptomatic, given that you've become infected, and then the distribution of how long it takes to become to die, given that you've been have the symptoms. So these are distributions that we know the parameters for. These parameters are slightly different from different countries. So in Brazil, this is perhaps more like 18 or 19 days from the onset of symptoms to death. Okay, so that's the basic model. So I can just emphasize a little bit more that in our model, we use mobility covariates from Google. And these include different things such as how much time people are spending in parks or how much time they're spending doing the groceries. So it's quite interesting. I mean, if you look at this for Brazil, you can see that in the cities, I think it's mainly in the cities that have big carnivals. You can see around the 24th, there's a big spike in the amount of time people are spending in parks. And there's a few features here that I'd like to point out that we try to incorporate into our model. So we can see this green line. This tells us the amount of time that people were spending at home has increased following the introduction of interventions. So we have interventions occurring around the 17th of March, give or take, and the amount of time people are spending at home increases. The amount of time people are spending at work or in transit stations or shopping, these things all go down. And something notable, though, about Brazil compared to other countries is that although there's been a substantial reduction in these descriptors of mobility following government interventions, saying people should be restricting their transport, or really, people should not be shopping or declaring a state of emergency. After these government interventions, people's mobility fell substantially, but it didn't fall quite as much as in some other countries. So that's just something to note. So in terms of modeling, there's a number of specific considerations that we have to take into account. And one of them is the infection fatality ratio. So this is your chance of dying given that you become infected. And this, we know, will vary from place to place. For example, the chance of dying depends strongly on age. And in Brazil, for example, we can see that the population pyramid is quite a bit younger than somewhere like the UK, although it's older than some countries. So this is something that you have to correct for and take into account for each place. So that's something that we've considered. In Brazil as well, we also attempt to take into account the inhomogeneity of the infection fatality ratio and how that changes from one state to another. So we know Brazil is a huge country and some states are significantly richer than others. So we might reasonably expect the quality of hospital care is higher in richer states than it is in the poorer states. So this is something that we've tried to account for as well, based on our understanding that high flow oxygen availability and ventilators, these are things that are going to be more readily available in the richer states. So we've tried to incorporate that into our model somewhat. Other specific modeling considerations, so I hinted already earlier about underreporting. So we consider different scenarios by considering different prior distributions to say, what would the results of our model look like if we were underreporting by 25%, or if there was 50% underreporting of deaths. Okay, and just another point on spatial heterogeneity. So across the different states, we use different mobility covariates because we know in Brazil specifically, like unlike some countries like France or Germany, the interventions that the government have mandated, telling people to stay at home, things like that, we know in Brazil these have happened in a very heterogeneous way, to say the least. I mean, different states have behaved in quite different ways. It's not been a national-wide application. Okay, so we can see the kind of results that we're getting in our report. Now, the report came out almost 10 days ago, so these predictions are a little bit out of date, but I can tell you that I've run the predictions every day since then, and we're consistently getting similar things in terms of the results that we see. So specifically, what am I talking about? The reproduction number is given here on the right-hand side. So this is the reproduction number, the time varying effective reproduction number. So the number of people, persons I'd expect one infected individual to infect. And we can see that following the interventions that are labeled here by this line, there's a significant drop around the same time, a significant drop in the reproduction number. But the reproduction number, as far as we can tell, does not drop below 1. And this is significant, and in contrast to most other places we've looked at where we see following government interventions, really that the reproduction number does drop below 1. So this really suggests that as far as we can tell from our model, we expect that the Brazilian epidemic will continue to grow, and it's not under control at the minute. Yeah. So as well as the reproduction number, we calculated things like attack rates. So this would be the total number of infections. So on the left-hand side here, I show the number of daily infections, and you can see that this has been rising, very quickly in the state of Sao Paulo. And compared to the number of actually reported infections, I mean, it's quite a substantial factor difference between the two. So there's a large amount more daily infections occurring than are actually being reported. And for somewhere like Sao Paulo, we were estimating the attack rates, so the percentage of the population infected would be somewhere around the 3% mark. Now, it was some days ago that we were predicting this, but I think there have been recent seroprevalence studies that have come out of Sao Paulo very recently, just in the past couple of days, and they're suggesting between 2 and 7% attack rates. And that's significant because although we know a lot of people have died, the number of daily deaths has been around the 200 mark for some time. It suggests that really in Sao Paulo and the rest of Brazil, we are nowhere near herd immunity. So I think that's quite an important point to make. And for somewhere like Amazonas, I mean, the epidemic across different Brazilian states is in quite a different degree of how much it's progressed. But no matter what state we look at, we see the same story over again, that the reproduction number tends to be slightly above 1, suggesting that in any state that we've looked at, the epidemic is not totally under control. Okay, so I think I can move on. So just to sort of summarize, in terms of the different effects of different mobility covariates that we looked at, whether people were staying at home or whether people were traveling, we can say something about the relative effect of these. We can say that we couldn't identify any single mobility factor as being the most important, but they all seem to have some effect on reducing their reproduction number. So just to summarize and come to some conclusions, there are a number of limitations that we're acutely aware of when we're doing this type of work. So we're aware that there's likely to be systematic underreporting of the deaths. This is something that we considered in this different scenario analysis in our report. And whether it was 50% underreporting or 66%, it didn't change our main conclusion that herd immunity is not close to being reached. So really, I mean, this is a substantial takeaway, and it suggests that without stricter controls, there's really quite a long way for this epidemic to go in Brazil. I mean, other limitations would be trying to do things at finer scale, but this is difficult because we have so far only really had access to death data, at least up to the time of report, at the level of states. In terms of limitations of the model, we're aware that there's substantial uncertainty in terms of the infection fatality ratio. We've calculated this at the level of different states, and we're generally between about 0.5 and 1%. This is similar to other countries, or perhaps slightly lower, which is to be expected through a combination of the younger age, but perhaps poorer health outcomes in some of the poorer states in Brazil. So these two things balance each other out. And there are some other model limitations, but perhaps we can come back to those in the questions. So just final conclusions. The reproduction number, as far as we can tell, seems to be above 1 across all of the states in Brazil that we were able to test. And the fraction of the population that has been infected in Brazil, as far as we can tell, is far below what's required for herd immunity. And the final conclusion I'd really just like to say is that, like any model, we're only as good as the data that we're provided with by the state, and this is really critical. So if it's possible to have, the most up-to-date and reliable data, this really makes our job in terms of modeling the epidemic and shining a light on how things are progressing much easier. So I think that's the main points I wanted to say from the report. But if you have any more questions at all, I'd be extremely happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, for this brief summary of the 21 report. I think it's very good for us to understand and the limitations. I think everybody needs to know that have several limitations, especially if bad data. If you have a bad data, it's quite difficult to predict, to understand how the things going on. I think it's excellent. Let's to move for. I think you have another question from Marcelo. Mm-hmm. Marcelo, can you do the next question, please?
Sure. Thomas, I was wondering, in terms of the model outputs, how can it build strategies in countries? You guys also did the same modeling for European countries, which had different ways of attacking the pandemic when the infection reached them. For example, UK and Italy, they started doing the isolation measures much later than us, but it seems that they were much more efficient in terms of adhering to the government recommendations. And for us, we did it earlier, but it seems, and you can tell by your data as well, that we were inadherent to those. So I was wondering, by these comparisons between countries, if we can, infer how bad we will go by not adhering, and other ways of also building strategies. Another question that I had was, you incorporated age into your model as well, because here in Brazil, the federal government talks a lot about doing this stratified isolation by age. They call it vertical isolation. So I was wondering if, by incorporating age into your model, if we can have a sense of how this stratified isolation would work. So yeah, Sorry to put two questions into one, but yeah.
No, not at all. So, I mean, I guess I can start first by telling you what we've done with age. So we have incorporated age as best we could, and the way that we, oh, can you hear me there? Yeah. So we've incorporated age as best we could, and the way that we have done that is by accounting for the different age distributions, which vary by state. But I mean, I'm happy to explain this model, like any model, has limitations. And even though that we're accounting for the age pyramid of each state, we're still ending up with an effective infection fatality ratio for that state. So we're not keeping everything resolved by age, although this is certainly something that you could do. It would be possible to calculate attack rates and reproduction numbers by age. And this is something that we're considering, but this would be a more sophisticated analysis for the time to come. In terms of the strategy, I mean, as a scientist, it's difficult for me to suggest what strategy someone should take. I can only tell you what I see in the data. And what I see in the data is that in countries, in most European countries, the effect of lockdown has been large and identifiable. This strict lockdown is just about the only thing that we can see in most countries that seems to help getting the IFR below 1. Now, in Brazil, it seems that there has not been a strict lockdown in most states. We don't see the same reduction in mobility that we've observed in France or Italy or Spain that have been effective in curbing the spread of the disease. So it seems likely to me that the spread of the epidemic is going to continue, at least in the short term in Brazil, unless there are changes to population behavior to limit transmission, either through people reducing their mobility, through stricter government lockdowns, like I think in France and in Italy it was very strict. If you couldn't go out without express permission, and there's fines for doing this. So I mean, I don't think it's been quite that strict in Brazil. Which is not to say that mobility is the whole story. There are aspects of transmission that are not captured by Google Mobility. For example, people can change their behavior in ways that limit transmission, but it can still seem like they're being mobile. For example, in the UK, we have this so-called 2-meter rule where we can't come within 2 meters of people. That's how it's supposed to be. And I mean, in theory, with this, you could still be mobile, but limit transmission. Similarly, perhaps wearing face masks would be another way that could reduce transmission that wouldn't necessarily be reflected in terms of mobility. So, yeah, I mean, I hope that's answered your question to some extent, or at least given you some information. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, for answering the question. And you have a more 1-2 questions for the audience, and the people can write here in the Zoom, like, or can make your questions. If you want to make one question to the people from Imperial College, you can open your microphone and send message to me, and you open your microphone and you can make these questions. I have one question for Igor. Igor is from, he worked in Fiocruz, Bahia for several years, and he has one question here. For Brazil, how do you deal with the complexity of accuracy of the data from different states? And in the same way, you have another question that made from Fabio from the UNB that asks, what strategy do you use to adjust for under ascertainment and delays in the notification? How this affect the quality of the prediction of the model? How are the major driver of uncertainties, and what you can try to do to minimize the problem? The 2 questions is related to to quality of the data and the accuracy of the data. And the majority of this, the aims of these two questions is to try to explain how you deal with this.
Yeah. These are really excellent questions. And as you've identified, there's two sources of uncertainty. There's uncertainty from the model, which we can estimate and control to some extent. And then there's uncertainty from the data, which is really the big issue. And it's something that's beyond our control. In terms of differences in quality of the data from different states, we're aware that this is an issue, but unfortunately, there's nothing we can do except rely on the data that's provided by the health ministry updates on the website. So we're somewhat reliant on that, but at the same time, we're cognizant and we're very aware of underreporting and lags, and the only thing that we can do to address this really is sensitivity analysis. So by considering different scenarios, and that we find that whenever we consider different scenarios and computing epidemiological measures like the reproduction number over the course of a substantial period of time, we're seeing the same kind of results for the reproduction number consistently, which suggests that it's somewhat robust, but also for things like whether herd immunities occurred. In all of our sensitivity analysis in terms of underreporting, for all reasonable levels of underreporting, for example, a factor of 2, we're seeing that we're just nowhere near herd immunity in Brazil, which is what we're similarly observing in other countries. I don't know if anybody else from the Imperial team would like to chip in on this at all.
Let's try. Have anybody from Imperial College that want to comment?
Yeah.
So the only, hi, Swapnil here. The only thing, which is still the same thing that Tom was talking, is that I want to say is, we rely, like going back to all things and earlier things about stability of model, uncertainty in model and everything. A lot of this relies on the fact that we assume that death data is reliable. But especially for the Brazil analysis, we actually made a quite of sensitivity analysis of assuming things like, what if there is a 25% underreporting or a 40% underreporting? And this underreporting is not necessarily an underreporting that's only happening in Brazil. It can happen in any country where a lot of deaths are getting undetected. So what I'm trying to say is, even if you see those underreporting scenarios that we have done, the only thing that changes is the raw numbers that we are doing for the infections and deaths. Not for infections, right? But still the major conclusion that the RT is not less than 1 is still valid for all of them under all underreporting scenarios, and which is a concern that we all should be looking into, and that is something that we should be looking into to do stuff.
Yeah, it's also, just to add to that, as well as the underreporting scenarios, so something that we're very aware of is the lag between notification and death, which is more of a problem in some countries than other. And I know a lot of people in Brazil, for example, are considering things like nowcasting to deal with this, and this is something that we're considering as well and hoping to incorporate in the model very soon.
It's good to this discussion because the reproductive number, it's related to attendance, not it's, if you have the underreported attendance during the time, this is captured by reproductive number. Do you agree with this affirmation, Thomas? Like, if it was constant, the subnotification during the time, you capture some thinking because you analyze it during the time, the variation of these numbers.
Yeah, you're completely right to say that the degree of under notification and the lag is something that's very difficult to capture. And this is something, for example, the lag is not constant. This is in fact a distribution, and this distribution changes with time, and it changes from state to state. So capturing this is very difficult, and it is a source of uncertainty in our model. But from all of, the only thing I can tell you is from all of the sensitivity analysis that we've done and getting the same conclusions time after time for 1 week to another suggests that the main conclusions of the report seem to be robust. But we're totally aware that there are limitations, just to stress that.
I think André have one question, André, and after that, Marcelo have another question.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentation and explanation of the model. It's very useful. One thing I would like to ask about the parameters and the estimates is regarding you consider the age distribution in the population as a parameter to adjust that and compare to other countries, but how do you take into consideration some social structure differences in that we see? For example, people in the lower socioeconomic strata, they are less likely to be in isolation than higher social income. And also there's a lot of heterogeneity between, for example, Amazonas is the biggest state in Brazil, but has a very peculiar demographics. So the capital, Manaus, has half of the population in this huge state. And how does it affect the estimate? So when we speak about 10% estimates of prevalence of infection or previous exposure in the state, probably Manaus has a large share of it, for example.
Yeah, that is a fair point to make. I mean, we're estimating attack rates of around 10% in Amazonas as the state. We can only distinguish Amazonas as a whole, and that is a limitation of the model. Of course, most of that probably comes from Manaus, but that's not something that we can distinguish. And of course, that would be the next stage in the analysis that we're looking to do, and probably lots of other groups in Brazil are looking to do, which would be to distinguish by states. So that's certainly a direction that we want to go in. In terms of accounting for the age structure, so we can do this to some extent by considering the contact. So I mean, the infection fatality ratio depends on the contact between different groups. So whether you're between 5 and 10 years old, you'll have different amounts of contact with people in different age groups. So rather than using, for example, the contact matrix for the United Kingdom or for China that have been used in other studies, we tried to use one that was more similar to what would be expected in a Latin American country. Unfortunately, this contact matrix, to create a contact matrix, this requires going and doing surveys and literally counting the contacts between all of the different age groups. And this is kind of time consuming, and it's not done for very many countries, and it's certainly not done at a state level or a city level in general. So this is a limitation, but we have at least accounted for the contact patterns that are expected in a South American country. To an extent, we also implicitly account for age in different states through mobility. So different states have different ages in general. For example, I mean, there can be up to 7 or 8 years difference in the average age in one state compared to another in Brazil. And I suppose this is captured implicitly through the mobility covariates in different age groups who will perhaps be more mobile or less mobile. So it's perhaps captured somewhat that way. Anybody else?
To add to Tom's point, right? So as Tom has said it very accurately, that right now in our model, we consider a state as a homogeneous population. And the question that has been asked to us is quite valid, that if the homogeneity in state is not there, then you're not getting that. And the answer to that is as simple as the way we are doing the analysis for a country as Brazil. You can actually take the same thing, do a do the analysis as a state in Amazonas, divide Amazonas into different regions that you think make sense, like different districts or different counties, and then you can do the modeling in there. But essentially, it boils down the same question, that at what level you are happy to assume that your population is homogeneous. And a lot of our study depended upon what we had access to. We had access to deaths by different states in Brazil. That's what we have been doing this. If tomorrow we get access to different counties in Brazil and having access to that, we would be more than happy to do it. And then we will have a different reproduction number or a different set of attack rates for each different region. So right now the regions are states. If you get more data, that's where you can get into. So that's one part of it, that yes, right now we assume each state to be homogeneous by itself. So when we are talking about Amazonas, we are considering Amazonas population to be homogeneous in itself, which is obviously not true. But then you can do as much as what you have data for. You have deaths for only that state. Therefore, that's what you end up doing. And actually, for age specific thing, we have this IFR model that Tom talked about. But apart from that, we also within our group, we have this group of people who are actually working on the age specific model, which is working on exactly telling you out of those all deaths, how many of those deaths happen in which age band group. But again, to get that thing, you should have some data from a country or a region where you have some deaths which you can relate to the age of the people. So we have got that access to some places like in Florida, some in UK, but we have not been able to find that data that useful. So we are very much happy if anybody can help us to get that data, because that is literally what you want to do, because it's not just the IFR, as you said, it's the different people are affected differently, they have different social patterns, but it is also, again, I might sound repetitive, but all the by I mean I and Tom, all of us, but all the thing boils down to the fact that what is the data that you have and how much is in there. So if we get more fine grained, yes, there are models where we have the proper age bands for these things.
Okay, I think Marcelo have another question.
Yeah, quick question, Thomas. I think you talked about this a little bit when there was a question about underreporting and the lag of deaths. But do you think using the metric of excess deaths will help in terms of accounting for these biases of underreporting and also lagging, and and also in terms of the robustness of your results?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think that's an excellent point, and that is something that we really wanted to get access to whenever we were doing this Brazil report, would be excess deaths resolved by week, or ideally even by a finer resolution. But unfortunately, we couldn't get access to anything like that at the time. But something like that would be extremely useful, because rather than doing this kind of speculative and very coarse-grained sensitivity analysis that we have done, I mean, we could really make the sensitivity analysis much more specific, but we could also perhaps incorporate a second stream of data into the model, using deaths recorded from COVID, but also using excess mortality statistics and directly put that into the model. I mean, I think that would be extremely useful, and if that data is available, and I think it might be becoming available, or it is soon for Brazil, that's something that we'll try to incorporate for sure. Thank you.
I think André have one question, the last questions. Do you want to make the last questions, and you can return to another participant in the Zoom?
So I think one question that's very relevant to us in Brazil is to know the expectations we have with a lot of, as you pointed out in the report and showed in your presentation, the isolation in Brazil has been very far from perfect, and we still have, they are well above 1. So there's a lot of discussion here. What's your opinion if Brazil is seen as the new epicenter of transmission worldwide, probably?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a fair comment. In the report, we were quite cautious and we said that Brazil is an epicenter in South America, but it's clearly leading in South America, and it's for an epidemic of this size, I think it's the fastest growing, which unfortunately agrees with our estimate of the reproduction number that this is well. I mean, it is certainly the epicenter in Latin America, and it's fast becoming, a main epicenter in terms of the whole world. And yeah, I mean, I think the situation is quite severe, and that it might be. I mean, our data suggests that, at least as far as we can tell, that some other measures might be useful in terms of trying to reduce the spread and keep the numbers of deaths and cases down. So we know, for example, that mobility compared to somewhere like Italy, mobility is seems to be higher. I mean, mobility is not the full story, as I've said, but the mobility that we're observing in Brazil is higher than other countries that have successfully stemmed the epidemic in general.
You have one question for the Vitor Porto. Vitor, can you make your question? Go ahead. You can open your microphone and make your questions. He tested here. Oh, he tested here. How many deaths could you expect if you establish a strategy aims at reaching herd immunity in a controllable way?
Yeah.
The discussion about herd immunity, it's very frequently in Brazil, and the idea, maybe you can explain a little bit what these numbers, how many deaths, because to get this herd immunity, you have some work that Igor test here too. That show in Rio Grande do Sul, 0.22 of the people get the infection. In São Paulo, it's close to 2% of the people already getting, and this is very low prevalence of infection in Brazil. And I think the Vitor question is very important, because it's too good to people understand for how long you need to continue to do this, and how time take for this.
And also, I think just to complement this this question, I think a comparison between the Scandinavian countries and the Swedish strategy, and how many more deaths, or how the extent of deaths compared to other countries that had a more stringent control strategy.
Yeah, well, based on what we know for Brazil so far, or at least what we estimate, we know that the attack rates are generally, highest in somewhere like Amazonas, where perhaps today they could be as high as 15%, but still far short of the estimated 70% required to have herd immunity. And in many states in Brazil, the attack rates are far, far below that. For example, even in somewhere like Sao Paulo, where the epidemic is very progressed, we're seeing attack rates of perhaps 4%, something like that. And in many other states, the attack rates are well below 1%. That's estimated from our model, other models, and recent seroprevalence results. So this suggests that in order to achieve herd immunity, there's really a very long way to go. I mean, I'm not going to predict how many people could die, because I think there's too many things that could change in terms of government policy, or in terms of the way that people behave, that could invalidate any predictions that I might make. But I mean, you can just consider that if the infection fatality ratio is somewhere between 0.5% and 1%, and 70% of the population is what we're looking at for herd immunity, that's a substantial number of deaths in a country like Brazil.
Thank you.
Just to give to Tom's point just for a second, right? Like, again, we will not like to produce any numbers in there, because we just don't know what's going to happen. But even in the places where it happened a lot, or even in the places where there have been troubles, or where, like in Italy and Spain, where people thought that a lot of that had happened, in our earlier reports, we estimated only around 5 to 4% of that population being infected, right? So it's not just about Brazil. The whole of most of the countries are quite far from herd immunity. Even the places like UK, Spain, or Italy, for which the deaths are quite huge, they are nowhere near herd immunity. I just want to say that those are also like 4 to 7%, not more than 7% in those three countries also.
I have one more question. It's more general. It's only to what your opinion is, not related to the models, but your opinion and the known opinion, maybe stat opinion. They join your meeting, and what will be the new normal in the world based on the COVID? Because the vaccine, probably you need more 1-2 years to get some vaccine to provide for the population, especially poor countries take more time probably. And what do you think will be this new normal, like social distance, they open the economy, and return some social distance? How this occur in your future?
That's a good question, and it's difficult to answer. You know, people like me, I spend so much of my time in front of a computer modeling the small details of this kind of epidemic that, you know, sometimes, yeah, I mean, we have to think about where things are going in the long term for sure. I mean, I think there has been a shift in the behavior of the population. I think that's going to be here to stay in the medium term for at least a year. I mean, you probably have more knowledge than me about the state of vaccine research, but it certainly seems like this is going to be a year. So, I mean, I think this is going to be require a long-term adjustment of our behavior in order to maintain, you know, reproduction numbers and infections at a level that will not result in our hospitals being overrun.
Thank you. I think it's a very good answer. It's the same way that you think here with COVID Café group. Esther, Nuno, you want to give some words for us? I think it's co-host this meeting. I think it's good if Nuno, Esther can give some words.
So first, my questions about the model. Do you correct, like if you are seeing the number, and now that we have 2 months of, do you see if the numbers were, do you correct your model by the real number over time? So that was something that I could not understand in your, and then where do you get the death number that I wasn't sure? Is this from the government or is this from open source?
Okay, so I can answer the first question. The death numbers are from the open source data that's provided by the government reports from the Ministry of Health. And for the first question, could I just ask you to repeat that, because my speaker cut out slightly there, so I just missed a bit of the first.
Correct, like you say, well, I'm doing all this and I think this is my RT, and so there should be some numbers of that in the next week. But now that we are 2 months after that week, and we know there is no delay, or the number you would predict, do you see, does it fit, or do you correct back the model if it doesn't really fit the number that occurred over time?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a good point. And I mean, what we do is we refit the models every day. Every day there's new data released, and every day our predictions change slightly, but consistently. Since we started, you know, looking really closely at Brazil, we're seeing the same patterns. Basically, every day since the interventions occurred, we're seeing that still the reproduction number is just a little bit above 1. And we're seeing this consistently as new data is added in, and we've had new data being added into the model for about a month now. So this suggests that our predictions are relatively robust.
I think you almost done. Don't have any new questions here in the chat, and it's very nice talk for during this 1 hour.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for inviting me. It's been great to discuss the work with you.
Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity for us and for Brazilians that can join and understand a little bit about this reported. And I give you more 1-2 minutes to final words, and you can finish your discussion.
Yeah, so I suppose just to summarize, the main conclusions of our report are that herd immunity, unfortunately, does not seem to be anywhere close to being reached in Brazil, as in many other countries. And since the reproduction number is above 1, this suggests that perhaps additional measures might be needed in order to control the epidemic in Brazil. And the reproduction number above 1 is something that we've been consistently observing. And just a final point is that, of course, we're acutely aware of the limitations of the model and the data, and that we would just like to emphasize that, you know, if we can get more accurate data, more up-to-date data that's resolved by age or by city, this is all extremely helpful, and this can feed into our model to help us make more accurate predictions. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for everybody to join us. And if you have, wait a minute. Okay, I think you don't have any more questions. Thank Thomas, Nuno, Esther, all from Imperial College that join us and try to explain the results of a reported 2021. And see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye for everybody. Thank you, Christopher, for your translation.